Initially, I was very skeptical about going to Rwanda after the negative things I'd said about the people and the president of that country. But since I'd embarked on a journey to tell the African story from an African voice and to bring unity to the continent, I had no option but to face those that I'd spoken so much ill about. I had also come to terms with the fact that the narrative that I'd given on Rwanda and its leaders was divisive and destructive. I knew that I had to atone for this. I touched down in Rwanda at about 4 on a Sunday afternoon. All along, I thought I knew what to expect. I expected to see clean streets, well-cut lawns, and the usual facade designed to impress visitors. But I wasn't prepared for what I saw. From the airport, Kigali feels like a huge, well-maintained office park in any upmarket part of a city anywhere in the world. All the roads were adorned with flowers, mature palm trees in the median divider, and well-established hedges on the sides of the roads that looked like they were placed there by the best botanists in the world. Being mountainous, Kigali has a lot of reinforcement walls on the sides of the roads, with ivy plants creeping on the side, giving it a look and a feel as if it's centuries years old. It's an unbelievable sight, to be quite honest with you. The grass and gardens are meticulously maintained that they don't feel like aesthetics, but they feel like the character of Rwanda. Pedestrians and cyclists have well-designed walkways and pretty efficient public transport system that illustrates that all these things are not just aesthetics, but they're actually part and parcel of what Kigali is all about, including every person and building a city around the poorest of the country. I'm shocked by the character of seamless organization, cleanliness, beauty, and people-centric functionality of Kigali. It's beyond impressive. And by the time we reach my hotel, which is in a street of various international brands, I'm in awe. At night, I go to bed pondering, why have those who've been to Kigali failed to tell us about the beauty of this city? More critically, why have Africans continued to allow our continent to be called the Dark Continent when the continent is so full of light? I've just touched down in Kigali, Rwanda, and I know many of you will be surprised that I, Rutendo Matinyarare, would actually be in Rwanda after all the negative things that I've said about the Rwandan president, the Rwandan people, and the history of Rwanda. Well, the truth of the matter is that after all the hurtful things and the derogatory things that I've said, and how it is that I have advanced colonial propaganda against these people, they have only approached me with love. I've met so many Rwandans all across the world. I've met them at BRICS summits, at the AU, and many other places where they've reached out to me like a fellow Pan-African and talked to me with an intention to educate me about the truth about Rwanda. After listening to them, I began to wonder if I really knew what was going on in Rwanda. I also began to realize that I've got to come on the ground in Rwanda and Congo and the Great Lakes to actually fully understand what is going on in this particular region and why brothers and sisters are fighting. I apologize to the Rwandan people because what I did is called parachute journalism. This was coined by Thabo Mbeki, who said that journalists in the West and in Africa oftentimes read a few books, read a few reports, talk to people and get anecdotal evidence on issues that are very complicated, and then they come up with narratives that are biased and oftentimes not true. The problem is when we have these biased narratives, what we do is we impact real lives. If my speaking, if the words that I say are divisive to us as Africans and cause us Africans to stand and fight against each other, then I have become a tool of imperialism. So that's why I'm here in Rwanda today. I'm going to travel the Great Lakes. I'm going to travel all those countries that have invited us to do this documentary that is going to seek to get to the bottom of this issue, or at least
to tell different sides of the story compared to what it is that mainstream media has been giving us for a very long time. It's time to unite Africa. It's time to conscientize our leaders that deploying soldiers and fighting each other, taking sides in a fight that is between brothers and sisters, is un-African. And I'll try and walk you guys through this documentary by speaking to you like this after every day or after every eventful discovery, so that I can keep reminding you the core issues that will pick up as we travel.
The next day, we woke up early and embarked on a 5-hour-long drive to Gisenyi at the border of Rwanda and Congo. The plan was for us to stop over at the Mutobo Demobilization Center to meet former FDR rebels who had returned to Rwanda to be reintegrated into society. We were meant to leave Kigali early, but apparently the roads to Gisenyi were blocked because of the Tour du Rwanda cycling event. Initially, I could not believe that a 129-kilometer trip to Gisenyi would take 5 hours, but I was to find out exactly why this was the case. We waited for the roads to open until about 10:30. Then we began the slow journey out of Kigali. For years, I thought Stellenbosch and Abuja were some of the most beautiful cities in Africa that I had ever seen. But now, I think Kigali and Abuja steal the cup. As we began to edge out of the city, we passed Nyabugogo Bus Park, the biggest bus park in the country in the north of Kigali. Just a few kilometers from there is the settlement of Katsata, which I could say was the first informal type settlement that I came across in Kigali. Nevertheless, it still looked better than some of the slums that we've seen in Africa and India. We then proceeded up a windy northeasterly road that takes us out of Kigali. On this single-lane road, progress was slow. Slow-moving trucks and buses were very difficult to pass. Despite progress being slow, the route was scenic. It had amazing mountain ranges in the north and deep valleys in the south. However, now and again, the scenery would be disturbed by stories of how the rivers in the valley, like Nyabarongo and others, had been laden with bodies who were killed and said that they must float back to the River Nile to Egypt and Ethiopia, where the Tutsis had come from. This was a stark reminder that this Garden of Eden that President Kagame had created had suffered and paid the ultimate price due to anti-Tutsi ideology that was still prevalent in Congo. As we proceed through the northwestern parts of Rwanda towards Congo, on the right-hand side we begin to see the beautiful scenery of the Virunga Mountains. We are told that for a once-in-a-lifetime experience of walking with guerrillas, you can pay anything from $3,000 and above. By late afternoon, the car starts to slow down. And then we take a turn that is written Mutobo Demobilization Center. We are fortunate that we reached there when 57 FDLR soldiers have just returned after 22 years in the bush to reintegrate and reconcile themselves with the society. As we drove into the compound, we see an impressive field of maize. There are buildings that look like workshops and classrooms, what looks like an office block, and a field where people are playing soccer. We park the car and we are met by the man that runs the center, retired Major General Cyprian Mudei. According to the Major General, the center offers the returnees accommodation, meals, recreation, sport, counseling, skills training, and even financial assistance to assist them to get jobs and opportunities to provide for their families before it lets them go. The center is run and funded by the Rwandan government, recognized and endorsed by the United Nations, which it works very closely with when people are being handed from Congo. The story about these soldiers left me touched. To see how a war can become a permanent feature in people's lives. Some of these rebels had been in the bushes fighting for 20 whole years. They left Rwanda in their 20s and were coming back in their 50s. It's a whole life spent in the bushes fighting for an ideology that is based on hate.
Can the Colonel tell us what was the purpose of FDLR What is its purpose today? What was it created for? And what is happening with them in Congo, and why did they go to Congo?
My name is Kano Uwimana Alphonse. I'm from the southern province in Huye district. I was born in 1973. In 1994, I fled the war and sought refuge in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We lived in a camp in South Kivu known as Nyamirangwe near Bukavu. In 1996, a conflict broke out between the ex-FARC and the AFDL. The fighting destroyed our camps, forcing us to flee towards Kisangani and eventually to Brazzaville. Eventually, we crossed the Congo River and arrived in Brazzaville in late 1998. We were recruited by the former FARC to assist Laurent Désiré Kabila in the war. It was only in Kinshasa that I received military training. There we joined the SADC forces to participate in the conflict between the Congolese resistance and the Congolese army. At that time, the FDLR was still known as ALIR, and we were part of the ALIR too. The FDLR's objective was to invade Rwanda, overthrow the newly established government, and replace it with their own regime. In Masisi, we engaged in numerous battles, though I would describe them as futile, as the leaders who commanded us emphasized that our primary objective was to overthrow the authority in Kigali.
Who are the groups that are in FDLR?
According to the 1994 refugee wave, the majority of refugees were Hutus.
So does it mean that when FDLR was fighting, they were fighting the so-called Tutsis?
Exactly.
Why did you come back?
The jungle was a place of constant conflicts. We were often told that those who return are mostly killed, particularly the officers. Many are killed immediately upon their arrival in the country. Through the families that had returned, we began to receive news of their arrival in the country. As a result, we decided to voluntarily return to our homeland.
In the bush, did they meet M23? Do they know of M23? And if they do, who is M23 in line with who they were?
We frequently encountered them when they were known as CNDP. As I understand it, M23 is a group of Kinyarwanda-speaking Congolese fighting for their rights, which are denied by armed groups, particularly the FDLR, Mai Mai, and other factions in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Many questions passed my mind. Were these men really genuine about reintegration, or were they infiltrators? It was almost impossible to get answers because the eyes of these men had become dead to emotions. More revealing was the hardships that these soldiers had to go through to get back home. The colonel started telling us about how he and his men had walked over 800 kilometers in Congo in order to get to Goma and to a UN center to disarm. He also told us about the painful beating that he once got, almost until his death, just because he had tried to escape and come back. On getting to the border, they hand themselves to the United Nations, who take their firearms and notify the Rwandan authorities that they have returning soldiers. The soldiers are then handed over to the Rwandan authorities, who conduct a process of screening. The most important part of the process is determining if they were part of the people that committed the genocide. If found to be participants of the genocide, they are locked up, tried, and if found guilty, they are sentenced. While those that are not found guilty are then integrated into Mutobo for them to be rehabilitated, skilled, trained, and given job opportunities for them to become meaningful participants in the economy.
It's a great privilege for me to have come to Rwanda. I'm privileged. First of all, to have the opportunity to come to a country where I had so many things to say without the knowledge. The fact that there's a reconciliatory culture in this country and a level of tolerance that I've never seen is the reason why I've had the opportunity to come and learn right now. The Demobilization Center has progressed a lot. And it is an example and a symbol to Africans, not only in Africa, but Africans in the diaspora. The gang wars that you see between our brothers and sisters in the Americas, our brothers and sisters in England, in Europe, we can learn something from Rwanda in that reconciliation is possible. Differences, irrespective of how big, can actually be settled. If a genocide could have been put behind people for them to build a country together, if they could forgive each other without revenging against each other, and if they can learn that the differences that they had were rooted in imperialism, we can learn the same. I'm so moved by what it is that I've seen here in Rwanda. And I believe that there is so much for us as Africa to learn. I hope that those of you that are still living in exile, scared to come home, you can learn that there are brothers and sisters that have done so many things, even took arms against the government of this country, and they've been welcomed back. This is a story that has taught us a lot.
We proceeded to Gisenyi, to a hotel where we're going to spend the night. Knowing that border towns are usually terrible and dingy, I didn't expect much except a bed, food, water, and a bath. I was tired, and I could not wait to get a meal and into bed. When we arrived at the Serena Hotel in Gisenyi, I was pleasantly surprised by its grandness. It was vintage, but well designed, and it made me feel like an explorer.
It has been a very tiring day, and I actually didn't think that I was going to sit down and do this debrief today because I'm just so tired. And the reason that I'm tired is because we drove for 6 hours from Kigali to Gisenyi. Now, for perspective, Gisenyi is 129 kilometers from Kigali. But as you would know, Rwanda is the land of 1,000 hills. So what happens is the road is meandering through the mountains, and these are single lane roads. There's a lot of traffic, and there's also some serious speed limits between 60 and 80 kilometers per hour. AI is hard at work, as Rwanda has got a speed trap system that is being called Sophia by the people of Rwanda, just naming it after the lady, the AI robot, because once you get hit by that speed trap, immediately you get the ticket in your SMS. But it was a very interesting day all the same, because we passed through the Mutobo Demobilization Center. And at this Demobilization Center, we saw reconciliation at work. We were fortunate that at the time that we arrived, there were a number of FDLR former rebels that actually come back home. And it was interesting to talk to them. We were not going to miss an opportunity to speak to FDLR and hear their side of the story. It's interesting to hear men who are in those bushes in Congo speaking for themselves and giving a totally different narrative to the narrative that we hear from the mainstream media and many people that are keyboard warriors but have never been on the ground. So we are now in Gisenyi. I'm in a beautiful hotel at the shores of Lake Kivu, and tomorrow morning we'll be waking up early and going through to Goma. The border is just 5 minutes away. I don't know what to expect, but one thing I hope is that we'll have an opportunity to speak to the leadership of M23 that took the airport at Goma. I'm tired. I'm going to bed, and I'll talk to you again in a similar briefing tomorrow.
In the morning, I was woken up by exotic birds. Opening my window was this great, beautiful lawn and vast expanse of water right in front of my window. In the water were little boats and fishermen fishing. I felt the same feeling I felt in Pemba in Mozambique not too long ago. It was an amazing view. Right across Lake Kivu, I could see Goma. The place looked like something from a travel magazine. It was so difficult to believe that this very beautiful place was filled with dark stories. The lake was surprisingly clean, beautiful, and tranquil. Even more impressive was Gisenyi and its walkways and the well-manicured lawns and beautiful houses. We left the hotel and began our drive towards the border. Beautiful houses, nice walkways, and what was really a pleasant drive. The Rwandans had outdone themselves again. The Rwandan border was modern, contemporary, and felt like an office block. We did our formalities at the border and began to drive from the Rwandan side into Goma. By the time we were in Goma, I almost didn't realize that we'd actually made the crossing, because the two sides are both built up and they merge so seamlessly together that it's almost difficult to tell that you are in Goma. My entry into Goma was a mind trick, because it just did not feel like I was in the Goma that we had been told about on the media. Certain parts of it felt like I was in an old part of Portugal or Italy, or maybe even Maputo. I guess Maputo is a more fitting example because of the black faces that were on the streets. Characteristic of most African cities in the east or west of Africa, there were motorbikes everywhere. People were going about their business, and occasionally an M23 soldier would be laughing and talking to people in what looked like casual social interactions. It was surreal. We then branched off into a street that ran in front of Lake Kivu. The scene was breathtaking. In fact, nothing in Goma at this time gave off any signs that this was a city at war. Because contrary to what mainstream media had told us, Goma was not Gaza. It was a city that felt like it was at peace.
Right, so what is happening right now is that we're waiting for our fixers. We got fixers on this side that are fixing for us to meet with the M23. The city is peaceful. As you saw, everything seems normal on the streets. I'm actually surprised by the city and what it looks like. Apparently the meeting could be at the airport, so we're just waiting for the phone to ring. And of course, there's always a danger in coming here. You never know whether there's going to be an attack, but we have to take risks in life. And for us to give you this story, for us to give you what is happening here in Goma, we have to come on the ground. When we speak to the locals, they say that it's actually quite safe. M23 have brought order into the city, but we'll never know, and we will show you everything that we're going to learn.
Our fixer then came and told us that she had spoken to M23 and they had sent their spokesperson who would take us through the city of Goma to give us a feel of the city while we wait for the leadership to approve our visit to the airport. We were then ushered into two cars and then we began the tour de Goma. The city felt like any other city in Africa, but it had a distinct charm as there was organization in its chaos. The streets were buzzing with vendors and people going about their own business. Little bikes carrying people into town, and yellow taxis were streaming all over the town. The markets and the shops were doing quick business as patrons went in and out. Nothing in Goma gave a hint that the city had just seen a major battle or major battles before. We could see school children going to school, and all this came as a surprise to us. With school children on the streets, we felt a compulsion to interview some people, especially the children, because generally children are more honest than adults. But predictably, many adults were not willing to speak to us. And according to what they said, they did not want to be victimized because among them in the city were still Katanyamas, Wazalento, and even Congolese soldiers who were walking around in civilian clothes who could easily victimize anybody that spoke against the government. On inquiring what the Katanyama were, we were told that there were a group of bandits who walked around looking for people who looked Kinyarwanda or Tutsi. Then we asked, what do Tutsi people look like? And the guy looked at me and laughed and said, they look like you. Tall, slender, with long faces, looking Maasai or Sudanese. And they would beat these people and burn them and then eat their flesh in front of everybody. I then said, why would they eat the flesh of the very same people that they hate? And he said, that is to put fear and to show that they're willing to do whatever to get rid of Tutsi people from parts of Congo.
So guess where I am right now? I'm in Goma. This is Goma. Business is happening, people are going to work, kids are going to school in Goma. And I know many of you are going to be surprised because you're expecting a war zone. You're expecting confusion and chaos. You're expecting soldiers on the street. No, it's peaceful. We crossed over the border, came into the country. I was surprised by how the city looks. The city is functioning. So why did we think it was a war zone? Because we're not telling our stories. We let CNN and the West come into Africa, tell our stories, but they have an agenda. And the agenda that they have is to make Africa sound chaotic, particularly Congo. They don't want Congo to function. They don't want Rwanda to function. Hence, you're beginning to see sanctions on Rwanda because they're making it sound like Rwanda is destabilizing this here Congo. Well, this is Goma. It's functioning. You actually see M23 on the streets doing their patrols, protecting the citizens of this country. And so, I don't know why people were telling us what they were telling us, but that's why I decided to come with my team here on the ground so that we could get the facts. So right now I'm going to get something to eat and then we'll chat again a little bit later.
As we continued on our drive, our fixer immediately received a call. M23 leadership had approved for us to come and see them at the airport. Immediately, an air of excitement went through the car as we began to change our direction and detoured towards the airport. We were finally going to meet M23 and get an exclusive opportunity to see Goma Airport, where the fight for North Kivu had begun. We began to drive through the streets towards the airport. And as we continued to go, we eventually started seeing a wall with towers that were manned by MONUSCO UN peacekeepers. And someone jokingly said, the reason that they are positioned here is because just across the road were clearing agencies where they could clear all the minerals that they were being used to take out of the country. I looked at the guy who was talking, hoping that he was being funny, but he maintained a serious face. And he said one of the things that the UN was doing in Congo was being used to transport minerals and to smuggle goods out of that country to Western countries that wanted them to remain in Congo. And he went on to say that part of the reason why Rwanda had become an enemy was that it was creating order in its own country that was infiltrating into people of M23 who were beginning to fix up the rot that had allowed many people to smuggle and benefit from Congo. Soon our cars began to slow down and we turned into the airport gate. At the gate were well-dressed soldiers wearing fitting uniforms, holding firearms in a tactical manner, and two M23 soldiers approached the vehicle where we were. They were told that we'd come to meet the leadership and that they had given an approval for us to come. Immediately, one of the soldiers went onto their satellite phones and called someone. Then he came back and asked to search the vehicles, and he asked us to turn off the GoPro that was sitting on the dashboard. We were then given strict instructions to stick to the tarmac and not to walk on the grass because apparently landmines had been planted by the UN, SADC, and the Congolese forces. The tour began right there in the front of the airport where it was written, "Welcome to Goma." From the entrance of the airport, the next place that we were to go was to one of the hangars where they wanted to show us the equipment, machinery and ammunition that had been left by the Allies when they had been defeated. At hangar number 1, we were shocked at the sheer volume of brand new missiles, rockets, bullets, and other equipment that we could not even identify. Not only were there weapons, but there also seemed to be an operations room that had a 10-meter-long image of the runway, surrounding suburbs, and even a few areas in Rwanda that was standing on a board. And above them were the images of commanders that looked like they were commanders of the FARDC or the Congolese army.
I would love for the spokesperson, vice spokesperson of M23 to help us explain what is this equipment here. There's very new equipment here. And what we've heard about some of the equipment is that some of the equipment has ranges of up to 150 to 200 kilometers. Now, you need to understand how significant this is. We're in a border town. Rwanda is 5 kilometers just down the road, and Kigali is 120 kilometers away. So some of the mortars, some of the military equipment, rockets and ballistics that they found here can actually go further than Kigali. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, why would machinery and explosives that can actually touch Kigali, armaments that can touch Kigali, why would they be here at a border town capable of actually causing destruction in a nearby capital city? So, how are you?
Fine.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Oscar.
Oscar, great to meet you.
Yes, nice.
Oscar, I am not a military man, so I would love you to explain to us, what are we looking at here?
Here we have heavy arms and their ammunitions. When we say that the government of Kinshasa is our first supplier in arms and ammunition, here is a proof.
Give me a
fighting against a big coalition. Okay, you understand? There were the FARDC, which is a national army. There were the Wazalendo, which are civilians, bandits from the Congo, Congolese citizens also. But they had looked for mercenaries from Europe, mercenaries, almost 1,500. There were SADC, Semi-RDC forces from South Africa, from Malawi and Tanzania, and there were also Burundian National Army.
All in this airport?
All in this airport, but they had bases also outside the town.
How many people altogether were here from all these sectors that you talked about?
Oh, we can talk about 60,000 soldiers.
What was the intention of the 60,000 soldiers being based here in Goma?
Okay, we have a proof from a video shot from the commander of Sami-RDC, General Jakupu, saying that, from South Africa, saying that they have a first enemy, which is M23, and that they have a second enemy. They finish first with the first enemy, and they will be shown a second enemy.
Who is the second enemy?
I don't know. They know him themselves, but I have the video. I forward it to you.
As a military man, when you hear this first enemy, second enemy, what do you think it means?
For that, for us, we said, who is the first enemy?
M23.
For sure, it's M23 because we are fighting with them, against them.
Yes.
Okay. And second enemy, I don't know. Tshisekedi was busy saying, he said that he wanted to change the regime of a neighboring country, namely Rwanda.
But I'm a bit confused. The SADC came here saying they're on a peacekeeping mission. What you're saying doesn't sound like peacekeeping.
It is not peacekeeping. It is not peacekeeping. What came here for peacekeeping, even though they were coming to the front line, was MONUSCO, the UN forces. But the SADC came in to fight us. And since the beginning, since they came in December, on 15th December 2024, they came straight on the battleground and fight us.
Which population was attacked by this?
Okay, mainly Kinyarwanda speaking population. I can tell you, we can go further, more than 150 or 200 kilometers from far from this place, you'll find that people speak Kinyarwanda. The hills, the rivers, the places, everything, it is named in Kinyarwanda language. That's our ancestors who gave the names to those places. And even now it is recognized by Google Maps, by everything worldwide, recognized that those places keeps those names, and those names are in Kinyarwanda. This volcano here, who used to erupt and destroy the town of Goma, it is called Nyira Gongo. And Nyira, it is a Kinyarwanda prefix, a Kinyarwanda name.
You are Kinyarwanda.
Yes, I speak Kinyarwanda.
You are from Rwanda or you're from Congo?
I'm from Congo, from North Kivu province, Masisi territory.
Ancestors?
Here. My village is 100 kilometers far from this border of you crossed this morning, westward inside Congo.
I don't know what to say because what I thought I knew.
I arrived in Rwanda for the first time in '96 as a refugee.
You were a refugee from Congo?
From Congo, yes.
So I'm here at Goma International Airport. We've been told that this airport has been destroyed. The airport still exists. The tower that was said to have been burnt is still here. This airport is still functional. But the problem is there were landmines that were planted. Now ask yourself, how could landmines be put here when the United Nations was here? Now, right now for this airport to start functioning again, the M23 who have currently secured it, who are currently governing in a city that we've actually gone through and seen it functioning pretty well, have to demine before this airport can actually start functioning again. So we're going to see what kind of weapons were here, what battles were fought over here, so we can really understand what is going on. All this gear that you see behind me belongs to FARDC, and there was also FDLR based here, the Burundians, the South Africans, the Malawians, Tanzania, the SADC troops were also based here. But this is what is disturbing. This is a vest. This vest is brand new. All these vests that you see behind are brand new. And the question is why? Because what you have to understand is that all these troops are linked and associated in partnership with the Congolese government. So the question is, why would there be so much new equipment ready at the border of Rwanda and Congo? Where was it going? What was the purpose? This is a helmet, a brand new helmet as well. There's hundreds of thousands of these. And the question is, what were they doing? A huge battle was fought here at this airport, Goma Airport. And that huge battle eventually led to the airport being taken over by M23. But M23 gave people an opportunity to actually surrender, put their weapons down, because they said, we're not here to fight you. We're here to fight for our rights against the Congolese government. But all these allies of Congo decided that they were not going to lay down their weapons. And now we're sitting with a situation where a lot of equipment, military equipment, has been caught. And we've also got landmines all over this particular airport. That's why it can't be opened until the mines have been demined and the military equipment has been removed together with this. So we've heard in the Western media that this tower was destroyed by M23. I'm at the airport today. It's the 25th of February, 2025. How do we know that that is correct? It is because just yesterday, England imposed sanctions on Rwanda. And part of those sanctions had everything to do with the destruction of Goma, the destruction of the airport, and all these other stories that are being given. But what is so interesting is that apparently the UN or MONUSCO took over this tower. They were the ones in control. And that's why many people are asking the question, how come there was an aggressive military force that was based here with all these parties, FRDC, together with FDLR, and others like the SADC force and
Burundi, who came here to actually undertake an aggressive war. But what it is that is being said is that when the UN took over, or MONUSCO took over, they decided to take control of the information from that particular tower that they got rid of, so that nobody could be able to understand what was happening and the plans that were there. And there it is, the UN and their vehicle over here. And as you can see, their files ransacked together with the equipment that was up in the tower.
At the tower, we made our way into the stairwell so that we could walk up to the top to see what we could find in the control tower. However, our progress was hindered by a lot of litter and even filing cabinets that had been put to block the way to the top.
So as you can see, I'm sweating from coming up this tower. But what we're being told is that this tower, which obviously is the nerve center of the entire airport, and we've heard rumors that it was destroyed. It's not destroyed, that's why we're standing in it now. But everything was ransacked. This tower was actually built by the United Nations, from my understanding, but before they were defeated and before this place was taken over by M23, they decided to take everything, all the machinery, all the equipment, and recordings that would have been able to assist us to get a head or tail of what is going on. Why would the United Nations take all its equipment? And why did they secure this place but allow certain forces to come in with weapons that could potentially threaten Rwanda, according to what we're hearing from the statements?
The tower was clearly left in a disheveled manner. So many papers, files had gone, filing cabinets had been removed and were blocking the stairwells, and all the offices had been stripped of all their equipment, computers, and machinery that had been there before. And the question kept ringing to us: why would they strip computers and everything that was in these offices, including the paperwork and the files? Was something being hidden? Was it to make sure that the airport would never be used again? On the side of the runway is a parking for aircraft. There is a helicopter that belongs to the Congolese army and 3 private aircraft that include a Russian Antonov that are parked. Next to the runway is another hangar. And so, from the tower, we went straight to that hangar.
So our understanding is that cars like this, left by the Congolese soldiers, are part and parcel of the equipment that M23 eventually takes and uses in their war. I was being asked, why do you ask us where we get our equipment from, when the soldiers of Congo, together with their allies, leave all this stuff behind for us, and we simply take it and use it? They say that the uniforms, ammunition, the cars, and sometimes even military aircraft are left behind, and they simply take them over and use them in their liberation struggle. So, as you can see, we've got bullets over here, and these bullets are used on the gunship, and they're used to shoot down from a plane or a helicopter. And over here, these are the missile launchers that are put on helicopters that actually have missiles inside, and these missiles are then used to attack. And apparently those missiles can reach up to 15 kilometers all the way up to about 40 kilometers, shooting at the M23 fighters. And then these ones actually were on the Sukhoi. These were the launchers for the rockets from the Sukhoi, and we're being told that these
launchers were actually used to attack Rwanda, and children were killed in that process.
From the hangar, we were told that the next place we're going to go was a place that was going to prove that the United Nations MONUSCO were in cahoots with the Congolese army and the allies in fighting M23.
What we're being told is that this particular base was the Burundian base. They had two bases. One is this one, and they had another one further up. They lost this position in this battle that took 2 days, a battle for the airport of Goma.
The proximity of the Burundian base to the UN MONUSCO and DRC sites made it look like it was not only a conjoint operation with the DRC, but also the Burundians. But as we got closer, it was actually written Conjoint Command Center, and inside it was actually spelled out UN MONUSCO Joint Command Center with the DRC. It was absolutely shocking.
When people like me speak, it makes it sound like we're advancing propaganda. But right here, you can actually see the logo of the United Nations, and it is written that Republic of Congo Forces Center Conjoint Coordination with the Army of the DRC, together with the United Nations, but also their partners. They were all in this airport fighting against M23, and eventually they capitulated. And they left all the weapons that we've shown you. And we understand that over 300 lives of the Congolese forces, together with their allies, were eventually lost before the airport was taken over by M23. So this is a standard tent that you would usually find. It looks like a UN tent. And apparently this is where some of their planning took place. We have keys, we have boards with what seems to have been plans and codes that have been used. It's written in French, but from my understanding, there are codes, Sierra 5, Sierra 9, Wendy, and also instructions on conjoint operations with other rebel movements. It makes you really wonder, why would you have a reconnaissance? Why would you be looking at constituting and reconstituting forces with rebel movements if you're undertaking a peacekeeping mission? All we do is ask the questions. It doesn't make sense that there had been a peacekeeping mission with rebel movements, some of whom are said to be genocidaires that came from Rwanda into Congo and are in partnership with the Congolese government.
So it's clear from this conjoint tent that there was some form of cooperation between the United Nations, the Congolese forces, the FDLR, and some of the other allies, if not all the other allies. But here's the question. How can the United Nations, which gets its money from other nations, use this money to take sides in wars when it is supposed to be a peacekeeper and funded to be a peacekeeper?
Look at this. I'm sitting on a Congolese military truck, FARDC truck, and behind me is the joint center that was MONUSCO, the United Nations, the Congolese government, SADC, and the 300 NATO mercenaries from Romania, and also the Burundians. If you remember, just a few meters is the Burundian camp or outpost. They had 2 of them, and eventually they lost them when M23 came and defeated them here. And the defeat came after M23 say they gave them an opportunity to actually surrender, leave their weapons, and meet at the stadium, but they decided that they were not going to do that. According to what it is that we're hearing from M23, even SADC forces did not accept to surrender. And hence,
there had to be a fight for the airport until the airport was captured by M23, and unfortunately over 300 people died. The people who died here were supposed to be peacekeepers, but the peacekeepers were apparently shelling into Rwanda, and also they seemed to have had plans to go further than just destroying M23 here. There was a second enemy that had to be destroyed. We're not yet sure who that second enemy is, but all I can do is to give you the information that I'm being given.
As we left the UN and DRC Congo Center, we made our way towards our next destination. Apparently, we were going to see where artillery had been placed, as it was used to shell into Rwanda and sometimes to shell M23 positions. To get there, we made our way through the runway. As we drove over the runway, it was clear that the runway had no damage whatsoever. As a result, the M23 placed confiscated trucks that had been taken from the Congolese army and its allies, and they removed the wheels or punctured the wheels to ensure that those trucks and equipment could not be moved to stop the landing of enemy aircraft or any aircraft to try and come and remove the prisoners of war that were being held here at the airport. Once we had reached the end of the runway, we had gotten to the positions where the artillery and cannons were sitting. Some of the cannons looked very familiar, with familiar colors that belonged to certain armies within the SADC region and also the United Nations.
So what we're being told is that these trucks were parked and were looking towards Rwanda, while there were drones that actually were sent up, about 68 drones that were supposed to take coordinates in Rwanda and then begin shelling into Rwanda. So as we've heard in Western media that there was a lot of destruction in Goma. But what is interesting is that there was a huge battle that took place for the airport. The capture of the airport was very important, as we also said, the capture of the hill of Goma. But come and see this to understand just how false some of these narratives are. These are houses just behind the very same airport where there was a battle for 2 days. There is no destruction. Those houses are still standing. People are still living in those houses. And the question is, where do the West get this narrative that there was destruction of houses in Goma? That's Goma. You saw children going to school. You saw a city that was active. You didn't see any destroyed buildings. So the question is, these narratives that we're getting, where are they coming from? Why are we being given? And why are we not asking questions? So for those who still want to understand the battle according to how we're being told by M23, is that on that hill over there, the Congolese soldiers were on that hill, shelling down from the hill to stop M23 that were coming from that direction. We're also told that over there, where the military trucks are, there was artillery that was placed there aimed this way, and this way there's just a few houses of Goma, and then right there is Gisenyi, which is now Rwanda. So the question that has been asked by M23 is, why would there be artillery that is facing that direction and also shelling Rwanda? So this is all public information, that there was shelling that took place in Rwanda. There was also a Sukhoi that also attacked in Rwanda. Not only that, this is the runway of Goma Airport. And as you can see, there are military trucks left by the Tanzanians and also the government of Congo. And those have been put to block the runway so that it cannot be used by any military to land and to start undertaking a military battle from here. But what is even interesting is just behind there is where the South African base was, or what is called SAMI DRC. It was right over. Even until now, you still got South African personnel and their military equipment in there. And from what we understand is that M23 is trying to facilitate food. Just yesterday, we understand that some sick and also soldiers who wanted to go back to South Africa were evacuated through Rwanda and they went back to South Africa. So that is what we're hearing from the ground. But the question that everybody keeps asking is, why were shells being sent just where you see those transmission towers over there? That right there is Rwanda. Gisenyi and Goma are one. There is no discernible division between the two. So the question is, who was being shelled in Rwanda by the artillery that was put there by the joint force of the Congolese together with SAMI DRC and other partners that were parked here at the Goma airport.
When we were done with our tour at the airport, the leader of the M23 who was taking us through the tour said that it would be best for us to go and see the forward bases and forward positions that were utilized by the Congolese army, FDLR and SADC to initiate the attacks on M23 that led to the Battle of Goma. So we got into our car and began to follow the M23 truck through the Goma communities. We began to drive north, going through high-density suburbs together with informal settlements until we got into the rural hinterlands in the north of Goma. As we were driving along, we were shown schools and fields where there had been previously refugee camps, where we were told that the farmers of the communities were forced into these refugee camps so that they could be used as a shield against attacks from the M23. Our guide then began to inform us that the reason why civilians would be used as a shield against M23 is because the Congolese government knew well that the M23 do not attack civilians. They also told us that the reason why the refugee camps were also established is that organizations like the United Nations and other NGOs made a lot of money when they had people in their refugee camps. It was beginning to make sense why the United States government had said that it was going to cut funding to the United Nations and to institutions like USAID that were fueling wars as the directors were making money from Washington. Now, for us to really fully understand how the Battle of Goma started, we have to go back into a little bit of history. The story starts in 2019 when Felix Tshisekedi was selected to become the president of Congo through an electoral process by an electoral commission that was manned by directors such as Corneille Nangaa, who is now one of the heads of M23. According to the story, Corneille Nangaa was in agreement with the election of Felix Tshisekedi. And so members of the M23 who believed that Felix Tshisekedi was a member of the opposition of what used to be the Congolese government, believed that they could negotiate with a fellow opposition member to come up with an understanding. After some time in 2021, there was an agreement between Felix Tshisekedi and M23 for there to be a merger of their armies and for them to secure Congo. The M23 then joined the Congolese army and they began to be dispersed into camps in various parts of the country. When they got into these camps, the word is that they started being killed by members of the Congolese army. The M23 raised an alarm with Felix Tshisekedi, but Felix Tshisekedi would not listen. So they were given a command to leave all their camps and to meet in the Sabinyo Mountains where they would begin to reconsolidate. When the M23 got back to the Sabinyo Mountains on the Uganda-Congolese border, they then began to take up arms again so that they would begin to fight for the territory that they had previously won before they began negotiations with Felix Tshisekedi.
So one more question that I've got. There is the saying that M23 is only a Tutsi army. What do you have to say about that?
No, this is false, just false. Our coordinator is Corneille Nangaa. He used to be the president of the Electoral Commission in Kinshasa. He is the one who facilitated the transfer of power between Kabila and Tshisekedi. Now he is with us because Tshisekedi betrayed all Congolese. Instead of implementing that agreement, he came to attack us where we were gathering near the volcano of Sabinyo. That was in November 2021. And the war started.
They began to grab cities in the north, Ruchuru, Bunaganda, and various other cities. And to take these cities, what they merely did was to surround these cities and give a small corridor for the Congolese army to be able to leave safely. Many Congolese men would leave their military machinery and equipment, and this would be used by M23 to reinforce its arms and to also increase its arsenal. As they began to capture cities in the north, they began to come down towards Goma. And in early 2024, before they hit Goma, negotiations began in Kenya. However, the Kenyan negotiations were not supported by many who believed that the Kenyans were partial to the cause of M23 and believed that Kenya had a relationship with Rwanda. So a parallel process was begun in Luanda, Angola. Many people believed that Angola was more neutral, and so the parties began another negotiation process in Luanda. In Luanda, an agreement was reached. President Lorenzo asked for M23 to stop coming down into Kivu to capture Goma and to hold on in a ceasefire position as negotiations continued. The M23, together with the Congolese army, agreed to hold their positions. By this time, the M23 had stopped at what are known as the Trois Antennas, or the Three Antennas, and also the Amabere Yankumi, or the breasts of the Virgin. They stopped there, and a peace force was put into Congo that was known as the East Africa Community Peace Force. There was a ceasefire for a better part of 2024. However, Felix Tshisekedi all of a sudden dismissed the East Africa Force and immediately asked SADC to come into Congo. Munwabusi Diakopo, the Major General of the SAMI DRC Force, or the SADC Force, said on television that their job was to neutralize M23 and to ensure that they destroyed this organization. As a result, the moment that SADC came in, the FDLR and the Congolese army, which were based at Kanyamahoro, began to fire at the positions of M23 at the Three Antennas and the Virgin's breasts. In retaliation, the M23 then began to move from the Virgin's breasts round Mount Nyiragongo and began to make their way through to Sake.
So right behind me over here, you've got Mount Nyiragongo. That is where M23 took a route into Goma. They went from behind there, from mountains that are further afield, and they went through Sake, through to go and capture a hill where the Congolese Defense Forces were situated. But this is what I find very interesting. Come and have a look here. So we are told that this particular area that we are was a base for FDLR. Over here you can see a gun position that is looking in that direction. In that direction is Rwanda. Those mountains that you see over there, those are the Virunga Mountains, and the Virunga Mountains are where most tourists who come to Rwanda come and visit the gorillas. So the M23 are asking a simple question. why are guns from FDLR pointing to Rwanda instead of pointing to M23? And of course, M23 were able to overrun this base, and then they were able to take over the base and continue into Goma.
So men and women started coming from the south, east, north, and west to come and converge at Sake. However, as the men were moving from the Virgin's breast, they were leaving a line of defense behind Mount Nyiragongo in a manner that was beginning to encircle Kanyamahoro and the position that Omega was standing, and also a base that belonged to SADC or the South Africans that was known as Camp Armageddon.
We have actually come to a training center that belonged to the Congolese army. And apparently what was happening here is that this was a training center where the mercenaries, together with the South African army and the Tanzanians, were here training people like the FDR and also training with the mercenaries on shooting on this shooting range. As you can see, there are distances, and the distances go from about 100 meters and 100-meter intervals all the way to, I think, a kilometer away. The base has eventually been captured by M23. That's why we're here and we're able to show you this. All this black rock is part of the volcanic material that comes from Mount Nyiragongo over the years, and that was used to create barriers for this particular training center. But what is disturbing is if the allegations are true, it means that FDLR was being trained here, and we know that there are genocideers in that particular group. And so if genocideers were being trained here by a SADC force, it's very questionable as to what the SADC force's intention was, particularly if they joined hands with mercenaries of NATO, Romania, who we know actually have no good intentions for Africa. We're coming from the shooting range where we told you that that shooting range is alleged to have been used by the South Africans, the mercenaries, and SAMI DRC to train the FDLR. However, we're being told that the evidence for that is this is a Tanzanian track, and it was captured at Mbambiro. They say that it was captured at Mbambiro in a battle, not a peacekeeping mission. M23 defeated the Tanzanians in that particular battle, and that's where this truck was captured. Alongside these trucks over here, which belong to the Congolese army, and they say that this place where we're standing right now was a training base, and was a training base for the South Africans with the Tanzanians and the DRC army, who were training not only themselves with the mercenaries, but there is a suggestion that they were also training FDLR and other rebel movements that are inimical to Rwanda.
By the time that the M23 reached Sake, they were able to surround Sake, and they left a small little narrow passage for the Congolese forces to leave. Nevertheless, the M23 soldiers then began to march eastwards from Sake to Goma. Unbeknown to the Congolese forces that were standing on Mount Goma, looking to the north and the northeast from Rwanda, hoping to see the attack that was going to be coming from the three antennas down into Goma. Unfortunately for them, they were surrounded once again by the M23 fighters that had come by surprise from Sake, and thus Mount Goma was overtaken. At this point, those Congolese soldiers that were on Mount Goma then made their way to the airport. On the northern front, at Omega's base and at Kanyamahoro, alongside at Base Armageddon where the South Africans were waiting, they were anticipating an attack to come from the three antennas and the Virgin's breasts. They continued to look to the north, hoping for a southward attack by the M23. But what they did not know is that they had already been encircled by M23 fighters that had come from Sake captured Mount Goma and were already in Goma and now coming back to the north to surround Armageddon, Nyamahoro, and Omega's positions. As the Congolese, FDLR, and SADC continued to fire from their positions to the three antennas and the Virgin's breasts, they began to realize that there were men coming from behind them. The M23 was slowly closing in the triangle that was strangling them. Immediately, there had to be a retreat. Omega began to retreat from his position to Kanyamahoro, and Kanyamahoro began to retreat from their position through to Base Armageddon. From Base Armageddon, the SADC forces, together with FDLR, the Congolese, then retreated all the way back to the airport. On getting to the airport, they began to plant landmines to ensure that no one would be able to scale the walls of the airport and attack them in the airport. Here at the airport, it was now UN MONUSCO, the DRC Army, SADC forces or SARMI DRC, together with the genocidaires FDLR and Mai, now waiting to defend themselves. Also in the base were the Belgian NATO mercenaries. Unfortunately, by now, the airport had been fully surrounded by M23 fighters. The M23 then sent communication asking all those in the airport to surrender their weapons and to march to the stadium where they would be held as prisoners of war. Those in the airport refused to comply, and as such, the battle for the airport began. According to M23, they did not want to fight in urban areas and among civilians as they had always maintained as their policy through and through. So they jumped over the walls and fighting began with small arms and hand-to-hand combat. Eventually, the forces that were at the airport were defeated and 400 lives were lost on that day. The battle for Goma illustrates that SADC, the DRC, and their partners had false intelligence. They had been waiting at Kanyamahoro and the position that was being held by General Omega because they believed that the M23 would come from the north, Sabinyo Mountains, but also from Rwanda. What they did not understand is that the M23 is being reinforced by over 10 million Kinyarwandan-speaking people that are living within Kivu and its hinterlands. This is one perfect example to prove that the M23 are not coming from Rwanda as has been suspected, but they're actually members of the Kinyarwandan community that numbers over 10 million people in Congo. And this is why the only solution to the crisis in Eastern Congo can only be solved by listening to the grievances of all parties, negotiating and coming to a negotiated settlement. Early the next morning, we woke up to catch a ferry from Goma to Bukavu, where we're going to meet the M23 leadership after they had successfully taken over that city. We got onto the ferry early and got some appropriate seating in the top section of the ferry. From economy class at the bottom to the upper decks, every seat had a life jacket just in case of an emergency after a disastrous ferry accident that claimed 78 lives in October 2024 on the same lake. In the middle deck was a canteen offering food and snacks and a very amazing tasty juice that was made in Congo. Along the way, we came across parts of Lake Kivu where you could actually not see any shore on either side. And then there were also parts where you could see the Rwandan side and the Congolese side all at once. There were islands that were uninhabited and some that were inhabited. Beautiful villas, beautiful farms and houses could be seen on either sides of this lake. It was a surprise to see so much beauty in the Great Lakes. It was even more surprising to see this in the Congo. For a moment while floating on the lake, I forgot that I was here to work. It was like a very high-class holiday. And maybe one day, When I'm not working, I'll be able to come and actually enjoy a holiday from this boat. After about 4 hours of sailing, we began to see the sprawling metropole of Bukavu on the hills.
Right, so we are finally approaching, almost there. After a 4-hour ride, it was pretty good. What is interesting is that unlike Goma, where the water was so clean through and through, we never saw any litter. We're starting to see litter here, and we're starting to see the city coming up in the background over there. We don't know what to expect, but I'm sure we'll have more or less of a cordial M23 leadership like we saw where we're coming from.
As we got closer to the shore, I could see shipbuilding workshops on the shorelines with half-built ships like the ones that we were on. I was impressed. It was good to see that a country like Congo, with all the bad news that is spoken about it, was actually creating its own ferries and had an industry to build ships that traverse Lake Kivu. Slowly, the ship began to approach land, and it hit anchor. We began to pack our bags and to make our way out of the ship. The fixer then walked out of the ship and began to call our hosts to see if they'd organized transport for us. Then immediately we began to hear the bad news, that at the meeting that had been held, there had been a bomb that had gone off.
We just landed with the ship that's behind us, coming all the way from Goma. We're supposed to have a meeting with the leadership of M23, but we understand that at the meeting that they were having, we were supposed to be part of that meeting. We were supposed to be filming the meeting, recording the meeting, but we understand that a grenade has gone off at that particular meeting. A number of injuries and deaths have taken place there. And we're still waiting, therefore, for the transport. We don't know what is going to happen. We don't know if it's going to be possible to meet the leadership after what has happened. The suspicions are that there was infiltration, and among the infiltrators, somebody brought a grenade that eventually exploded and injured people. We obviously, like every other human being, feel scared, but we still want to give you this story. So we'll keep you posted as to what is going on.
As a result, no one was going to be able to come to pick us up, so we had to hold tight until the security situation was secured in the city. After a number of phone calls back and forth between our fixer and M23, eventually our ride came. We began to drive through the city of Bukavu, and we passed through the Plaza of Independence where the grenades had gone off. People were still milling around. There seemed to be little groups of people that were talking, illustrating that they were still trying to understand what had happened on the square. But the biggest crowd had already dispersed. People had gone home, and the tragedy was still being absorbed.
I'm looking out there, and it could be a city in Europe, city in South America. But this is Bukavu in Congo. Beautiful, enchanting, romantic. And I'm beginning to understand why men and women have been fighting for this land ever since the colonizer came. It's beautiful land. Everybody would love to own it. And we're here, coming from Goma. We took a boat trip up Lake Kivu. The most beautiful views one can ever imagine. We came after meeting M23 who were holding down the airport in Goma. We came to meet their leaders who were here for a meeting with the public and the people of Bukavu. They had a huge, I would like to call it a rally, but it was actually a meeting where thousands of people came. And then somebody decided to throw a grenade into the masses, killing 17 people. And so for that reason, we couldn't attend the meeting. In fact, we're lucky that we were not there. And so the meeting that we're supposed to have with the leadership of M23 didn't take place. But we had the opportunity to actually see why somebody is trying to terrorize the public. Somebody wants to fill the public with so much fear to make it feel like the city is not secure. That is why that bomb was thrown. It's terrorism. It's a means to try and make the city ungovernable.
Immediately at 8 o'clock, our fixer's phone rang, and she was told that we had to meet the leadership of M23 at the General Referral Hospital of Bukavu, where it is that the leadership were going to visit the patients of the bombing. It was really impressive to see a so-called rebel movement behaving like a government in waiting, visiting a community that had been terrorized, and also calling the media to show the world the human side and to communicate to the world that they were there to reconcile a nation that had been split. As we arrived at the hospital, there was security and soldiers everywhere. It was now that we began to realize that the chairman, Bizimwa, together with Colonel Nanga, were both there to see the victims of this bombing. It was a huge risk for two of the most senior members of M23 to be coming to a hospital together to see the patients of a bombing, risking another bombing at the hospital. But this also showed their confidence in the security system and their intelligence system. By this time, we did not know that the reason why our meeting had not happened in the afternoon is that a few of the bombers and some of the terrorists that had been involved in this bombing had been caught and were being interrogated by the intelligence service of M23. We then walked into the hospital, following Colonel Nanga and Bisimwa to every single tent that had been put in the hospital. The level of disaster management preparation that we saw at the Bukavu General Hospital was really a marvel. They had prepared makeshift tents on the outside or the courtyards of the hospital for all the patients that had been injured. And so we went from tent to tent as Bisimwa and Colonel Nanga spoke to the patients individual by individual. They asked doctors to give them updates on how the treatments and operations were going. And they also commiserated with the families of those that have lost loved ones. These were leaders that were actually proving that they were more than the guerrillas and terrorists that they've been painted to be by mainstream media. After the visit, we were told to return to our hotel room because the chairman might still be able to meet us at about 12 o'clock midnight for an interview. Nevertheless, the call then later came to say that we would meet the chairman the next day for our interview. The next day at about 8 o'clock, two drivers were waiting downstairs for us to take us to a secret location to meet the chairman of M23. We jumped into two separate vehicles and they sped through Bukavu to an unknown location for us to have our meeting. On the way, what caught our attention was how clean the streets were. There were people cleaning the streets and the drains. As we began to ask the driver what was going on, he said that as in Goma, they had embraced the spirit of Buganda to clean their streets and to collectively look after their city. Within 20 minutes, we reached a property where there were soldiers at the gate and surrounding the grounds. It was almost as if we'd reached a presidential palace. We were then told that the chairman could only afford us 1 hour before he could go to another meeting. And as such, we were asked to start setting up our cameras to get ready for the interview. Once we were ready, the chairman came out and came towards us. He immediately recognized me from our Addis Ababa meeting and greeted me with a smile. Despite the fact that Bisimwa speaks perfect English, he asked us that he would want to speak in French. Clearly, he was thinking about his constituency, the Congolese people, inasmuch as he wanted to reach the English-speaking population of the world to tell them the story of M23. For the purpose of the documentary, we have taken excerpts of the interview, but the full interview will be available in a separate podcast that will be put with the title Talking to the Chairman of M23 on Telling the African Story from an African Voice.
Good morning, sir. Great to meet you once again. So, first of all, I would just like you to introduce yourself.
My name is Bertrand Bisimwa. I'm the chairman of M23 and vice coordinator of Alliance Fleuve Congo.
Tell me, who is M23?
The March 23 movement is an organization of Congolese people dedicated to protecting civilian populations threatened by their own government, which has decided to kill them. As a result, we are engaged in a fight for our existence.
Where did it start from?
The history of M23 dates back several decades, beginning in the 1960s, shortly after independence. The Banyarwanda populations have long been regarded as foreigners. In the 1990s, during the Sovereign National Conference held in Kinshasa, they were expelled from the conference on grounds that they were simply considered Rwandans who should return to their home country. Successive governments following Mobutu's rule failed to address this issue and ensure the security of these people. In 1994, a wave of genocidaires fled Rwanda and settled in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, exacerbating the situation. The Rwandophone populations, particularly the Tutsis, were driven off their land by the same Interahamwe who had perpetrated the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. These individuals were forced to live as refugees, and to this day, around 100,000 of them live in refugee camps in Rwanda, with smaller groups residing in Uganda, Tanzania, and even the United States. In fact, you may recall that at the time, the government in Kinshasa had effectively armed the Interahamwe, the Mai Mai, and the Congolese armed forces, providing them with weapons to continue sowing insecurity and perpetrating the violence. During the RCD's time in Kinshasa, the problem remained unresolved. We rose up and established what we call the National Congress for the Defense of the People, CNDP, to negotiate security in the eastern part of the country and the return of our compatriots. Unfortunately, the agreement we signed with Kinshasa, known as the March 23 Agreement, was not respected regarding key issues of security and refugee repatriation. Instead of addressing the root causes of the conflict that led us to take up arms, the authorities preferred to offer us positions in the army and government without resolving underlying issues. When we called for the implementation of this agreement 2 years ago, the Congolese government refused to honor it. Instead, they began expelling our officers, who had only recently joined the army. As a result, officers like General Makenga, with their troops, rose up. He retreated to the heights of Goma, where he went into hiding to avoid being killed. And from there, he founded the M23. Therefore, the M23 movement originates from the March 23 Agreement, which was never implemented. The M23, in essence, is a demand for the fulfillment of the March 23 Agreement.
Tell us about the Battle of Goma.
First of all, the Battle of Goma was particularly a challenging one. We acknowledge the difficulty of the situation, and we were ourselves surprised by the obstacles we faced in Goma. It must be noted that when the enemy chose to attack us, they made public statements declaring their intention to dislodge us from the Goma region. They initiated an attack, and we responded by stating that if the attacks from Goma continued, since the enemy was using the Goma and Bukavu airports to strike our soldiers and harm civilians in our territory, we will take action to seize control of Goma and Bukavu airports. This would allow us to paralyze the planes used to attack us. We issued this warning a month in advance, but unfortunately, the enemy underestimated our resolve and proceeded with their attacks. That is how we ended up in Goma. What we did not anticipate, however, was the large number of troops and weapons in Goma. Upon arrival, we discovered that there were about 5,000 and 8,000 mercenaries stationed there. In addition, the FRDC troops were well experienced, and there were forces from SADC, Burundi, MONUSCO, Wazalendo, and the FDLR, all present together. More than 40,000 troops were stationed in the town of Goma to confront and trap us. In addition to the troops, they were equipped with sophisticated and long-range weapons. It was at this point that we realized that with such advanced weaponry, we were not the only target. Neighboring states were also in the crosshairs. Tshisekedi had, as he mentioned in interviews, prepared to launch attacks on neighboring states from Goma using these weapons, which fortunately were able to seize. When we entered the town of Goma, we were faced with this reality. As you know, in our military tradition, we avoid fighting in large towns. When we advanced from Chanzu through Bunagana, Chengerero, Ruchuru, and Kiwanja, all large towns, we surrounded them, and the enemy understood that these positions were no longer defensible. They had to retreat. We expected they would act similarly in Goma. Unfortunately, in Goma, the enemy chose to entrench themselves and attempt to trap us. In fact, the military governor, who was the deputy governor in Goma, later told us that he had made a public statement on the radio and television. He stated, "Listen, Goma will be the tomb of the M23. It was then that we realized the situation was far more complicated than we had initially thought. Kinshasa wanted the battle to be fought in the town of Goma. However, Goma belongs to us. It is our town, belonging to the people of the eastern region of the country. Goma was built through our efforts, by us, the citizens. It was not the government that constructed Goma. The beautiful houses and roads you see in Goma were built by the people, not by the government. With this in mind, we resolved that we would not destroy our own work. We reassessed our strategies for the fighting within the city, adapting them to the reality on the ground. We decided to neutralize the enemy without resorting to heavy weaponry. First, we took away the heavy weapons they were using to avoid damaging our town. Then, we engaged in direct contact with them. It was close quarters combat, hand to hand, that we carried out within the town of Goma in order to minimize collateral damage. This is why in Goma you saw more casualties on the side of the fighters, including the FRDC, Wazalendo, and others, than among the civilian population.
We arrived in Bukavu 2 days ago, and we realized that you were having a meeting with the public, and then there was an explosion that took place. Does this mean we've got infiltrators that still remain within the society? And how are you going to ensure that there's no terrorism similar to that in future? And can you just take us through what happened at the meeting that caused the explosion?
First and foremost, what occurred at the place of independence was an act of terrorism. The terrorism orchestrated by the regime in Kinshasa. The primary target was the civilian population, but we were also included. On the eve of the meeting, messages were broadcast on social media, which the forces allied with the Kinshasa government took responsibility for. These messages urged the population not to be of assistance, as they planned to kill the AFC coordinators. In executing their plan, they intended to place bombs at the two petrol stations at the entrance of the place of independence, hoping explosions would cause widespread casualties. However, they were deterred from doing so because we had deployed military personnel at these two petrol stations, preventing them from carrying out their attack. As a result, they decided to target the area around the grandstand. Unable to access the grandstand itself, they remained below and waited for us to march again. When we entered the place of independence, we did so on foot, and they anticipated our movement, planning to throw grenades at us as we walked, aiming to strike between our legs. Fortunately for us, security personnel brought vehicles to the foot of the grandstand, allowing us to enter them. This significantly reduced the attackers' room for maneuver. As a result, they resorted to throwing grenades, which caused casualties. We were able to capture two terrorists who had passed through the area the day before. They provided statements that will now help us trace the entire chain of events and identify those responsible. What did we uncover? We found that the explosives used in the attack are still in use by the Burundian army. This indicates that the criminals or terrorists involved likely came from Uvira, where the Burundian army is currently operating. In summary, the threat is clear. The Congolese government, through its ties with the Burundian army, is recruiting Somali terrorists to carry out attacks on the Congolese population. This is a government that uses terrorism as a tool.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for taking too long.
It's okay. I'm on time.
You're on time. All right.
The interview with the chairman left us dumbfounded because so much very critical information had been revealed. One of the biggest takeaways that came out was the fact that SADC had not come on a peacekeeping mission, but they and the Congolese government were actually intent on attacking Rwanda and removing the Rwandan government. These were the allegations made by the chairman. But more critically, we were happy to hear that they do not want to see the division of Congo, they do not want a secession of any part of Congo, but they wanted peace and they wanted an opportunity to have power sharing or a federal system that allow people that are sometimes 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers away from Kinshasa an opportunity to be governed by people of their own creed and people of their own communities. From the interview, we headed straight to the border post known as Rusizi 2. We had to get back to Kigali because I had a scheduled podcast at 8 o'clock that night that I had to attend. But even before we got to Kigali, we were supposed to pass by a refugee camp of Congolese Kinyarwanda-speaking people in Rwanda, in Nyamagabe, to interview these people that had been displaced from their homes in Congo. As the driver sped through the streets of Bukavu, we had a last look at this city. I have to say that Bukavu, just like Goma, had been a mind beep. Because in my mind, I never expected Goma or Bukavu to look like normal cities and cities that were vibrant and full of life. It was also surprising when we got to the border to see so many Congolese and Rwandan people crossing the border. The citizens of these nations were busy crisscrossing the borders, trading with each other, and working in each other's countries. It was an example of how it is the citizens of these two nations, speaking similar languages, sometimes speaking the same language, were brothers and sisters who traded and did business together without any problems. It was inspiring to see the relationship between the Rwandan citizens and their fellow Congolese citizens that were not tainted by the politics between their countries. When we got onto the Rwandan side, our driver was waiting to take us through a 6-hour journey through 169 kilometers of road that lay ahead of us. As we began to drive out of Rusizi, I saw yet another ferry building company with many boats that were not complete. These boats had their bare steel that had not been painted, and they were shaping up into being ships. My mind immediately began to race that the Zimbabwean steel company known as Dyson in Manize could find a very beautiful market for the steel that is needed for the ships that are being built in Congo and Rwanda. Right here, I started realizing that Africa is not as dark as we believe. People are manufacturing boats, buses, cars, but the stories are just not being told. And right there, I began to think, as part of my journey of telling the African story from an African voice, my next trip will be about talking about the industries that are taking place in Africa, particularly in Congo. The route from Rusizi was scenic. Misty mountains, valleys, tree plantations, and meandering roads. In about an hour, we hit the Nyungwe Reserve. It was teeming with monkeys and duikers. And for the first time since I was in Rwanda, I saw the enchanting indigenous forests of Rwanda. It was mesmerizing. The tropical forests were rich, luscious, breathtaking. It felt like I was in a tropical rainforest. Along the route were soldiers that were marching with guns, protecting visitors that come into this nature reserve. Nyungwe was enigmatic, with endless undulating mountains and valleys. And before we knew it, the rainforest gave way to sparsely vegetated farms, and we were now getting closer to Nyamagabe. The whole point of stopping over at Nyamagabe was to experience a Congolese refugee camp with Kenyan Rwandan speaking people in Rwanda. According to the count, Rwanda currently has almost 200,000 Kenyan Rwandan speaking people that are refugees in their country. When we arrived at the refugee camp, we asked for the chairman of the refugee camp. The chairman got in the car, looked at us, and gave us a huge smile. Then he greeted us and told us that the refugee camp had 12,000 displaced people who lived there for the past 23 years. He then told us that he was going to take us through the refugee camp so that he could show us the places in the camp. We began to drive. We could see these mud, pole, and dagger huts that he said were the accommodation and the houses of the refugees. Then we went through to the front of the refugee camp, and there were beautiful, pristine offices that he said were the offices of the NGO that ran this refugee camp. There was also a beautiful school built from brick and cement that was also part and parcel of the camp. This didn't make sense to me. How could a refugee camp have such beautiful buildings for the officials who then leave every day to go to their homes, but have pole and dagger huts for people that were permanently staying there for the past 23 years? Not only was that the only thing that frightened me, but even as we began to go down to the soccer fields to watch the children playing the soccer game that they were playing, we also passed these construction sites where they were building these retaining walls in the very same Kenya Rwandan style of putting stone and concrete to hold back the mountain. So much money was being spent on a private company to build these retaining walls, but no money was being spent on the houses in which the people lived. I was left dumbfounded. Beautiful drainage systems were being built while people didn't have proper houses. I then asked who was doing the building. We were told that it was a private company. I asked if they were training any of the community members or the refugees so that they could use the same technique to build their houses. And the chairman said, well, some of the refugees were being trained, but they hadn't started using the skill to build houses. Soon we're at the soccer field where the children of the refugees were playing soccer. It was a very festive environment as the kids looked like they were enjoying themselves. But one couldn't help but actually ask themselves, were these kids really happy because they were happy? Or were they happy for the moment as they played sport that made them forget their problems? I then began to conduct interviews with the chairman and the woman in charge of the ladies.
Hello, Mama. How are you? So tell me who you are, your name, and your position here at the refugee camp.
Thank you. My name is Mirakivi Elizabeth. I serve as the Vice President of the Camp Management Committee.
So tell me, how is life being a refugee here at the refugee camp?
First and foremost, we are deeply grateful for this country for providing us refuge and ensuring our safety.
What do you say to the people from Congo and some from even Rwanda who are living in exile, who say that you are not Congolese people, you are actually Rwandans who went into Congo as refugees and you don't belong there?
We are Congolese. I personally arrived in Rwanda for the first time as a refugee. I'm now over 50 years old, born in Congo. My grandfather and great-grandfather were also born there.
If you had a message as a mother to the Congolese government and to other governments in Africa, what would you tell them?
It was unfortunate circumstances that forced us into becoming refugees. However, our roots lie in farming and cattle breeding. While we acknowledge the safety provided to us, life here remains extremely difficult. We are unable to work. Humanitarian assistance is no longer sufficient, as my friend told you. Regardless of the aid we receive, there is nothing that compares to living on our own land. We urge the Congolese government to reflect seriously on our identity and origin. Furthermore, we call upon international human rights organizations to visit us and hear our voices before making any assumptions about us.
So for me, I was very emotional because when I see her, I see my mother. I see a widow. I see women that have no one to take care of them, and their governments are abandoning them, their men are dead. And sometimes when we make commentary about stories of other countries, we comment without knowing that real lives, real people, real kids are affected by what is happening, by the decisions made by politicians. And my appeal is to the Congolese government, it's time for you to start looking at a way to reconcile your nation with its citizens. To the Rwandan government, well done and thank you for looking after people like our mother here. And to the rest of Africa, it's time that you begin to fight to unite this continent and not to divide this continent by not taking sides, reconciling brothers and sisters. And to the international community, you have begun to impose sanctions on a country that is taking in refugees that are being displaced because of tribalism that was brought to the continent by imperialism, colonialism, and dispossession. We want to appeal to the United Nations
who we heard were taking sides in this fight, and to other humanitarian organizations and governments to consider people like this lady and these children before you make rash decisions to sanction, to send soldiers, or to take sides. Thank you, Mama.
There was silence in the car as we drove back to Kigali. I had seen a lot and learnt a lot in the past week that I had been in Rwanda and Congo. Real lives of real people were being jeopardized by self-centered African leaders and not white colonizers. Yes, colonialism has had a great impact on Africa. Colonialism is the reason why Rwanda is divided and has got some of the problems that resulted in the genocide. Colonialism has something to do with how the Congolese view Kenya-Rwandan-speaking people and why they persecute them. However, we cannot justify the hate that we Africans, who are victimized by these Europeans, continue to exert upon ourselves because of a fake tribalism created by the philosophies of the Bantu migration theory and the Hematic theory. We can't blame that on the European. That has to rest on us. And like Kwame Nkrumah said, as long as Africans do not unite, bring down the borders, and as long as they do not decide to break with the colonial system, will forever be subjugated. And it's clear that the people of Congo, the people of Rwanda, the people of Africa will continue to be subjugated as long as we are divided, holding on to these little national territories and colonial borders.
Now that I had spent 1.5 weeks in the Great Lakes and heard its stories, I now had questions that needed answers. How did we as Africans get into this mess? How did M23 and the Congolese government begin to fight? And why was it being blamed on Rwanda? For the answers, I had to go to an institution that was the most authoritative custodian of the history of Rwanda, the Kigali Genocide Memorial. So the question I asked myself is, why did I say some of the things that I said about Rwanda that played into the hands of the genocidaires who did not want Rwanda to work? Why had I said sentiments that risked dividing Rwandans and destroying the great work that had been done by the Rwandan government? A sense of embarrassment overcame me as we approached the genocide memorial. I realized that I had spoken without appreciation of what was at stake, and more importantly, I had spoken about an issue that I was not well informed about. But now I was going to come face to face with an institution that knew the true history of Rwanda that I had bastardized. When we arrived, the memorial was organized and meticulous as everything else in Kigali. It had a long driveway lined with palm trees, and these trees made the memorial feel like it was centuries old and a resting place for fallen heroes. It was a serious place, but not dark, despite the dark history that it commemorates. It was interesting to see people treat this place as a place of remembrance, but also as celebration of the unity and success that Rwanda has achieved over the past 32 years. At the entrance, it says, Kigali Genocide Memorial, Remembrance and Learning. This was an illustration that this is not only a place of remembrance, but it is also a place for those who want to learn and those who are misinformed to come and learn about the dark history and the great future of a nation that took itself out of what was a destructive moment in their history. At the entrance, we're met by Lidi Mutesi, who takes us through the memorial.
Rwanda comes from this verb of kwanda, which means to expand.
The history of Rwanda is long and interesting, but for the purpose of this documentary, I will summarize, while the full documentary of the history of the country, as given by Lidi Mutesi, will be covered in a documentary called Rwanda's Painful History and How It Carved the Bright Future. In short, Rwanda was an ancient kingdom known as Rwanda. Rwanda being a word derived from the verb kwanda, which in English means increase. The verb increase was used in reference to the objective of the Rwandan leadership, which was to increase the nation. Rwanda was unified by one tribe, one language, one religion, and a fluid class system in which the cattle owners were called Tutsis, the farmers known as Hutus, and the artisans and hunters of the forest, the Twa. Anyone could shift from one class to another by changing their labor practices or economic position. So a farmer or an artisan who could develop enough of a cattle herd could become a Tutsi and vice versa. The society was led by a council of wise men from all social classes who advised one monarch who usually came from the society's wealthiest class, as in most African culture, so he came from the Tutsi class. Unbeknown to the Rwandans, the fate of the nation was being shaped at the Berlin Conference in 1844, when it was carving up Africa and their nation into pieces. A Belgian king by the name of Leopold would get the richest mass of land on the African continent and in the world that was known as the Belgian Congo. This Belgian Congo, the richest piece of real estate on earth, would be derived by amalgamating over 400 kingdoms and tribes, while also dividing some tribes as they took lands from places like Rwanda, Burundi, which is Burundi today, and also Uganda to form the Belgian Congo. What was unknown by most Africans is that this partition that happened at the Berlin Conference, in which they were not included, would leave a legacy of conflict and genocide that we see today. Because, for example, the Rwanda that we see today at about 26,000 square kilometers is only a small fraction of what it used to be as the Rwanda Kingdom, which had 78,000 square kilometers. So not only did Rwanda lose 66% of its land, but it also lost 60% of the Tubara belt of minerals that makes Congo very wealthy, and also lost over 70% of its population, not only to Belgian Congo, but to Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi, where most of the Kenya-Rwandan-speaking people live today. Today, about 10 million Kenya-Rwandan people are found in the Congo. And if you understand the conflict that is currently happening in Congo today, it has everything to do with this group of people that were alienated and are being persecuted today in the Congo. With Leopold having taken the jewel, Congo, the small little pieces like the leftovers of Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi was then given through to the Germans, who were left with what they called the East Africa Empire. This East Africa Empire also included Tanganyika, which is Tanzania today. In 23 years after the Berlin Conference, the Germans would subsequently lose in the First World War and lose their East Africa colonies. Those colonies were then bequeathed to Belgium. By the time the Belgians took over Rwanda, the Rwandan kingdom was still whole. The people of Rwanda remained united under one single monarch, language, culture, tribe, and religion. But the Belgians intended to subjugate the Rwandans and were in no way prepared to have a nation in which Africans lived the way they wanted to live. With that, the Belgians now decided to impose that which was in Belgium, a situation where the French aristocracy, known as the Walloons, were marginalizing the Dutch, who were known as the Flemish and the majority, through an identity document that would create legal races among a people that used to be united.
Belgian colonialists, they strengthened these divisions which were initiated by German colonialists, because Belgians are the ones who established this identity that you see here. when they said that we have races, you remember when we started that Rwandans were people who spoke one language, who shared culture, and who lived together. You can imagine introducing this terminology of race in the same people.
So, the taller people with straight noses and high cheekbones were designated Tutsi and alienated by being called Nilotics or Hematics. Meanwhile, the shorter, flatter-nosed were called Hutu and Bantu, in line with the Bantu migration created by Wilhelm Bleek and used by the Germans, English, and Dutch to divide people in Southern Africa and to alienate them from their ancestors, the Khoi and the San. They went then to take this on to the next phase, where they began to educate those that were designated Tutsi in their IDs, giving them administrative jobs, calling them more intelligent Nilotics, Hematics, and even Caucasians at some times. They placed them in supervisory positions over the Hutu, who were given menial labor, as they were said to be less mentally endowed as Bantus. This did not sit well with the king, Yue Fife Musinga, who began to resist the division. In 1931, he was exiled into Congo so that he would not continue to influence the people of Rwanda. He was replaced by his son, Mutara III Rudahigwa, who was a little less vocal than his father. But even then, he began to agitate his people to create democratic movements to liberate themselves as the Rwandan people. And as usual, the Belgians were not happy. Rudahigwa would later be killed by his doctor after going to a doctor's visit. The next in line was his brother Kigeri V Ndaindurwa, who took over and began to advocate once more for Rwandan independence. More importantly, he began to create alliances with people like Julius Nyerere and Patrice Lumumba to fight for the independence of Congo. And it was such an entrenched relationship that when the Belgian flag was brought down by Patrice Lumumba, Kigeri V Ndaindurwa was there right beside him, holding the flag with him. The Belgians then exiled him to the United States to ensure that he never once again came to be an influence to the people of the Great Lakes. Soon after, they also murdered Patrice Lumumba. And as much as Kigeri and Lumumba were out of the way, the Belgians did not stop their attack on what they believed was the Tutsi monarchy and the Tutsi people from which the monarchy were coming from. They began to agitate the Hutu to join hands with the Belgium and to liberate themselves from the oppression of the Tutsi. This gave rise to the Perma-Hutu Party and Hutu extremists who had an anti-Tutsi ideology. And instead of the Belgians giving independence to the Rwandan people from Belgium, they decided to give independence to the Hutus and the Belgians from the Tutsi. They created a joint government and immediately began to advocate for pogroms against the Tutsi people. Within that period, 30,000 Tutsis are said to have been killed in pogroms by a joint parliament and government of the Belgians and the Hutus. In those neighboring countries, the Tutsi began to organize themselves, and they began to ensure that they were united in all the countries where they were to create a military formation that would come back to fight for the independence of the Tutsi people who had been removed from their country. Many of the Tutsis went to train in Tanzania alongside people like President Museveni and his Formosa, which they joined to go and remove Obote. From this war, the Tutsi people joined hands to create their own political party known as the RPF. And with that, they created a military wing that was known as the RPA. With that, they were going to march back into the country to fight for power in the event that the RPF was not able to negotiate for a return home. When the Tutsis asked Habyarimana to return home, they were told that there was no space. And with that, under the leadership of Frederick Gwema, the RPA began to fight for liberation in Rwanda. Shortly after that, the Habyarimana government would ask for negotiations that led to an agreement in Arusha, Tanzania. But a lot of people within the Habyarimana government, including Habyarimana's wife, Agatha Habyarimana, were not happy that Habyarimana was talking to the opposition or the Tutsi. As a result, there have been allegations that Agatha Habyarimana, together with the French and the Belgians, orchestrated the bringing down of Habyarimana's jet in order to maintain Hutu supremacy. The death of Habyarimana and anti-Tutsi hate on a number of radio stations in April 1994 was used to ignite a genocide against the Tutsi, and there was an orgy of killing and hate that saw 1 million people dying before General Kagame and the RPA fought Habyarimana's government at Interahamwe to liberate the country from this evil dictatorship. With that, former Habyarimana and Interahamwe fighters fled into exile. Many of them went to Canada, Australia, the United States, Europe, and some of them even went into Congo and SADC, where they continued to preach the Belgian ideology of division with plans to come back and remove the government in Kigali because it is a Tutsi government. Other fighters went into Congo and formed the Mai Mai and the FDR that were used to persecute Kenya-Rwandan Tutsis living in Congo with the intention of driving them off their land into being refugees in Rwanda, Uganda, and other neighboring countries of the region. With that, there was an uprising from those members of the Kenya-Rwandan Tutsi community in Congo to start fighting back and defending themselves from these pogroms. This was the beginning of M23.
So I'm finally back from the Great Lakes. And the reason that I'd gone to the Great Lakes was to try and get an understanding of the biggest war that is taking place in the world since the Second World War. We've been trying to understand what is causing the war in Congo that continues to cause the deaths that we're seeing. And we've heard many stories about what is causing this situation. The dominant narrative says that Rwanda is the reason why Congo is in trouble. And the reason being that Rwandans want the mineral resources of Congo. There is also another theory that says that the Rwandans want to control Africa, and they're being used by the West to achieve that particular result. But when I went on the ground, I saw something totally different. Africa continues to have a problem because of the legacy of imperialism. But even though there is a legacy of imperialism, more importantly, Africans have continued to hold on to the principles of imperialism. They've thrown away Hunu or Ubuntu in order to be divisive and tribalist. And so because of these divisions, we have had a war that has killed over 6 million people. Because the people of Congo believe that they are justified to try and protect the colony created by Leopold, the loot of Leopold, by chasing out Kenya-Rwandan speaking people from the traditional lands. The Kenya-Rwandan speaking people in turn say we have a right to defend ourselves from anybody that wants to remove us from our ancestral land, so you have an endless war. And when the Congolese go into Kivu trying to destroy the M23, they fail. Because the M23 consists of the community of over 10 million Kenya-Rwandan speaking people, plus millions of other tribes that they intermarried to who are also loyal to them. Hence, when the Congolese army goes into these eastern provinces of Congo, their soldiers desert, because their soldiers are related to some of the people they're fighting in M23, and some of them have loyalties to them. This war will never stop. And this war will never stop because we as Africans refuse to listen to what Kwame Nkrumah said, that if you want to beat imperialism, you have no choice but to break down the borders, unite Africa, so that the nations that do not have ports can have ports, so that those nations that do not have resources can share the resources of other nations. We can have a single market for our mineral resources so that we can determine the price, and we can have a central bank and a central army to defend ourselves from imperialists. He said that as long as you remain little nations like a Rwanda, like a Burundi, some of the smallest nations in the world, you will always be bullied, isolated, and defeated by imperialists. Not only that, you will lack resources, and therefore you'll have to fight your neighbors in order for you to feed your people. On the other hand, you also might have to compete at the lowest possible cost of your mineral resources because you're competing with your neighbor. But this problem is not unique to Congo and Rwanda. Right now in Southern Africa where we are, a problem is brewing. The people of Lesotho are beginning to say to the South Africans, during colonialism, you took over 210,000 square kilometers of our land, and we want it back. So as much as South Africa is self-righteous to go all the way through to Congo, trying to stop the crisis in Congo, they have their own problem in their backyard, because the problem that we have continued to maintain is the same. We have continued to maintain imperialism by keeping our colonial borders. We have to bring down these colonial borders. And we need to change the education system. The Bantu migration theory is a lie. The Hematic theory is a lie. We need to build a united Africa.